Hello and welcome to Living with and Beyond Cancer. My name is Steve Pointon from Steve Pointon Counselling and Support. This is a podcast for people who have had cancer. As a twice diagnosed kidney cancer patient who has been in remission for 7.5 years, I recognise the trials and tribulations of what happens next once we have finished treatment or our long-term maintenance treatment and try and return to our lives. Welcome to this latest episode where I'll be exploring the story of a very inspirational lady. This will definitely tug on the heartstrings, but I know the power this story has. Before we go on to today's episode, if you do want to know more about me and why I am doing this podcast, please go back to episode 1, which was released on World Cancer Day on the 4th of February 2026. So, today, I'm delighted to be joined by somebody who, despite living at the other end of the country and has only ever met myself once, has become a really good friend of mine. Somebody who has so many shared experiences with myself, along with a heartbreaking outcome. There is so much more to this story, so why don't we say hello to the inspirational Charlotte Forster?
Thanks,
Welcome,
Steve.
Charlotte.
Thanks for having me. Lovely to be here.
It's great to have you. Before we do get going, I just wanted to clarify, Charlotte's here today in a personal capacity, and her views are all her own. So, Charlotte, do you want to set the scene for us? Take us back to the beginning, if that feels okay. Who are you, and how did all this start?
Yep, happy to. So, yes, I'm Charlotte, and I'm dialing in from Southeast London. I live here with my daughter, who is coming up for 6 years old. So I was 22 when I met Andy, and within a few weeks of dating, he sat me down one evening and told me that he had had cancer in the past. He told me that he was currently NED, which is no evidence of disease, and was being scanned regularly to check for recurrence. And I guess I was shocked that he had been through a cancer diagnosis at such a young age. I think he was 21 when he was first diagnosed. But I suppose in my naivety, I didn't feel that worried because I was reassured that he had had 18 months worth of clear scans. And that filled me with a lot of hope, I guess.
So what cancer did Andy have, and what sort of treatment had he had to that point?
So he had been diagnosed with kidney cancer when he was 21. Immediately had had his kidney removed. So his tumour was quite large. It was 16 centimetres upon diagnosis. When they removed the kidney, they had realised that there had been some small spread to surrounding lymph nodes. And so he embarked on a treatment I know, Steve, that you know very well, IL-2, interleukin 2, which is a very intense and difficult treatment in terms of side effects. And that is the treatment, is a type of immunotherapy. And that's what put him into the NED situation that he was in when we met.
So that treatment, when he had the IL-2, and you are right, it's a brutal treatment, it's horrible. Was that something Andy had had after he met you, or when he'd met you, or was that before he'd met you?
So that was before he'd met me. So
Okay.
the kidney removal and the IL-2 were pre me. Everything else was post me.
Okay. So how did that make you feel? I know you said you were reasonably reassured because he'd had 18 months of clear scans, but I'm assuming, and probably assumption is the mother of all evil, isn't it? But how did that make you feel going into a new relationship, and just that uncertainty, I guess, of never really being quite sure?
I guess um I was shocked. I had at age 22, I was lucky enough to have not had many dealings with cancer amongst friends and family. And so I was quite new to the whole cancer world and the jargon and all of that sort of thing. I naively didn't feel that worried. I felt like, he was young, he was otherwise healthy, he was in this kind of NED state. And so we just continued to get to know each other and continued dating, albeit for a short time before things took a slight turn for the worse.
So before we come on to that, Andy, obviously this guy you've been sort of attracted to or got to know for however that came about. How was he coping at the time? New relationship for him? Was he okay to work and things like that? Because IL-2 is brutal, and I know I had a lot of effects for a number of years afterwards, some of which I probably still suffer from to the day. So how did Andy cope with that? at such a young age?
So when I met him, he was seemingly very healthy. He worked a 9 to 5 job. He was very busy. He had a busy social life and was doing all of the things you would expect he was 24 when I met him, a normal 24-year-old man to be doing. Um, I know he'd had the stints in hospital with the IL-2 and the kidney removal, and obviously that took some time to recover. And I think he lost a lot of weight during the IL-2 as well. But at the point at which I met him, yeah, s was very healthy. He was full of life. He was working. He was ambitious. He had lots of friends that he saw regularly, and he seemed no different to any other 24-year-old man. And I think that's why I was so shocked when he told me that he'd had cancer, because he wasn't sat across the table from me looking like what you would imagine a cancer survivor to look like.
Yeah, I guess that's something that as 20, early 20s, new relationship, limited experience with cancer. I guess hearing that word even later in life is brutal, but I guess you have a certain sort of expectation of what that looks like.
Mhm. Yeah, agreed. And you don't come across many people at a young age that are diagnosed, and so you hear cancer, and maybe that's changing now. I think it probably is, but you hear cancer, and you typically think of someone that is a bit older and someone that's maybe a bit more unhealthy. You know, he didn't drink a large amount of alcohol. He'd never smoked. He was physically active, and so he wasn't your stereotypical candidate to become a cancer patient. And I know that the cancer doesn't take that into account, sadly, when it comes to who it decides to target and affect.
Yeah. So you managed to sort of build your relationship with Andy despite, I guess, regular scans. And you mentioned a little while ago, a few minutes ago, before things started to change. So it's okay. What happened next?
So we'd actually only been together for a few months, or only known each other even for a few months, and it was his first regular scan since we'd met. And this scan took place, and he received a call to say that there was something that needed further investigation, something looking slightly suspicious, which then led to him being re-diagnosed, this time with stage 4 cancer, just 4 months after us meeting. So we were very much still in that getting to know each other phase, that kind of non-committal point in your relationship. 4 months in, for him to be told, you've got incurable cancer, it's back, was a difficult conversation to have. Gave me the chance to walk away, given that things were so new between us. I felt like we had something special. I didn't particularly want to walk away, and so I didn't. And so our relationship, I suppose, became quite serious quite quickly after that. I think up until that point, we were maybe both being slightly reserved, or, we were keeping our cards close to our chest still somewhat. But that all falls away, I think, when you're faced with something so serious.
Yeah, I mean that on its own is quite a commitment from you to say after 4 months, I'm going to stay here and be alongside you through this journey. That must have been quite reassuring for Andy.
I think so. I think he certainly was less naive than me. He knew what was likely to come in terms of how he would be feeling throughout any potential treatment. And I think he really wanted to give me the opportunity to not have to go through that with someone that I hadn't fully committed to yet. And yeah, as I said, I think in my naivety, I just didn't know what was to come, and perhaps that shielded me from the brutal truth of how difficult it would be. And I don't think I would have made a different decision had I known, but I think it was an easier decision to make. I guess I was blissfully ignorant of what a journey for a cancer patient might look like.
Do you feel that you had all the information? I absolutely hear you wouldn't have made a different decision, but for you to remain in that sort of naive situation, naive state, do you think you got all the information of what a stage 4 cancer patient meant, and I don't necessarily mean from Andy, I mean from the medical professionals and people you were working with?
No, I don't think we did. For a while, Andy tried to shield me from the appointments. So he didn't want me going to the appointments with him initially. That changed quite quickly because he needed to have some surgery just a few months after that diagnosis. But I certainly don't think there was anything in the way of signposting to, various different support groups that I might have found useful. And that is probably the point at which I started seeking that out for myself, because often it can be a lonely place to be when you or a loved one gets a cancer diagnosis, especially when you're at an age when you've not come across that before. And there was no one in my circle that could relate. I didn't know anyone else that had a partner with cancer, and I just wanted to find some people that I could talk to.
Okay. So who did you manage to find to talk to? What sort of support was out there for you?
So I think the first place I ventured was Macmillan. It's probably the first place you tend to think of when you think of cancer. I found their online forums. I found a page dedicated to kidney cancer, and I started posting a few things in there. And there were things like, and I've looked back over the posts since, but things that I didn't feel comfortable talking to Andy about because I didn't feel like we were in that place. So things like, how does this affect your fertility in the future? So I knew at that age I probably wanted to start a family, but we'd only been together a short time. That really hadn't come up for us in conversation at our age. And so I just wanted to equip myself with the right information around that without having to make him feel awkward or uncomfortable by asking him those questions himself, which frankly he probably hadn't even considered at his age. I think from the Macmillan forums, someone pointed me in the direction of Kidney Cancer Support Network, so KCSN, which is now Action Kidney Cancer. And that's where I know we met Steve many, many years ago now on their virtual Facebook support forum. And that's been really the source of support and information that I've used over the years. And I've used it a lot. For me, having information and feeling like I'm knowledgeable about something has helped me feel more in control of things, and that's been I guess a coping tool for me.
Yeah. I mean, I spoke on the first episode of this that we did about the invaluable sort of support you get sort of round the clock, isn't it, with Action Kidney Cancer as it is now on that simple Facebook forum. I mean, it's a charity, it's a full-blown charity with lots of wonderful information on their website. But that forum of talking to other patients and other carers, when you don't understand something, it can help you, can't it? But also it can arm you with information when you go and see the specialists and the consultants.
Agreed. And there's been lots of times over the years where I've known about a drug that is being trialed directly through my involvement with Action Kidney Cancer. And I've kind of raised that in an appointment and have said, would we be eligible for this? Would we be eligible for that? And I just wouldn't have known that without having access to that information. And as you say, it's things like side effects from drugs. Has anyone got any tips for dealing with you know,
Yeah.
sore feet, sore hands, fill in the gap, whatever the side effect is. And it's just patients supporting patients and carers as well.
Yeah, absolutely invaluable
Mhm.
service, and yeah, it's massively underfunded by government. Any kind of support charity is in that way. But so coming back to your situation, so you mentioned surgery for Andy. What sort of happened next with Andy?
So he started quite quickly on a TKI drug called axitinib, and that was with a view to shrink the tumours that they'd found, which had cropped up in his kidney bed and a nearby lymph node. And then within a few months of that, the drug had shrunk the tumours to an extent that they felt that they could operate to remove them. Because often with kidney cancer, one of the best cures is to cut it out. It offers a very high chance of, getting rid of it all. So that's what they decided to do. Surgery was deemed quite difficult because of the location of the tumours. So one was very close to the IVC, so the inferior vena cava, or Cava. And so they needed the vascular surgeons there. There was one that was quite close to the bowel, so they needed the bowel surgeons there. There was a whole team of people. And that surgery took place in the September. So I'd moved into his flat in the August. So bearing in mind, we met the previous November. So I moved in within 9 months with a view to being around at home or to help him during his recovery when he came out of hospital.
Wow, well, that's quite a quick. Everything's gone on there in quite a short space of time. It must have been quite a
Mhm.
whirlwind for you. So you move in quite quickly. Andy has his surgery. Sort of then where do we go?
So they think they get it all. It was about a 6-hour operation, I think. They uh, thought had been completely successful, but follow-up scans showed that there'd been continued spread to surrounding lymph nodes. Um, and so that's when, and I lose track of which drug came first, to be honest, but that's when he then started again on the TKI. I think it was axitinib again that he started on, um, to try and keep things at bay and keep things from growing too quickly or spreading to any other locations.
So where are you and Andy at in your relationship now? Because it's still quite new and this is starting to look not very good at all.
So he'd been on axitinib for a number of months previously in the run up to the surgery, and that had been quite difficult in terms of side effects. To an extent, I guess a lot of it would have been his mental state, I would imagine as well. But he spent most of that summer sort of in the flat with the curtains closed, not feeling very well at all. I think by the time he went on it a second time after the surgery and after he had healed, his body had had a chance to recover and sort of flush it out of its system. He'd also, I think, adapted some sort of ways of coping with some of those more intense side effects. So we played around with dosages. So things like 5 days on, 2 days off when things got too bad, having a short break if we wanted to go away for a weekend, take a short break of the drug. And the oncologists were fine with that. I think with his age, they wanted him to have, a semblance of a quality of life. And I think as time went on, he just became more in tune with what the side effects were doing to his body and what he could do preemptively to stop those becoming too debilitating.
Yeah, really, really tough. And it's common, isn't it? And most people listening to this that are cancer patients or carers will recognize the change in dosage, the regularity, and just the debilitating nature of some of this medication. So during this sort of treatment, how's Andy coping? Sort of, is he managing to work? How are you guys coping financially? Because new relationship, living together. I know that, and I'm sure you're going to tell me that no matter how good a job anybody has or how secure it might be, this gets financially tough at times.
Yeah, so he actually was largely able to work through most of it. He obviously had an extended period of leave when he had the surgery, but he did continue to work. The time that he did need off, I mean, we've both been very lucky to have very good employers in terms of sick pay and benefits like that. So he was on full pay. We also weren't going anywhere over that summer because he felt too
Right.
rough. So our expenditure was lower because we weren't going away or doing the things that other people would do on a weekend because he just wasn't feeling well enough to leave the flat. But eventually he did start to tolerate the drug quite well and was back at work full time.
Right. So what happened next?
So there's a number of different drugs that you can take for kidney cancer and with Andy, he tended to fare quite well on them, but they have a shelf life. And for him, he typically bounced between different drugs every couple of years. So they reached a point when axitinib stopped working for him. And throughout the regular scans, it was noticed that actually there's been significant enough growth and or spread to need to think about swapping to another drug to control things. And so that's what we did. And we did that a number of times over the years. And I can't even think of how many different treatments he's had. They refer to it as first line, second line, third
Yeah.
line, etc. He must have been over the years about seventh line in terms um, of drugs that he had. And there was a mix of TKIs, which axitinib was, and immunotherapy, which he also had. And things steadily carried on progressing, but were being held at bay enough for us to lead a relatively normal life. There are a couple more surgeries thrown in there and infections a couple of times, which resulted in kind of short disruptions to our life, but nothing too substantial. We just carried on ticking along, booking our holidays, seeing our friends on the weekend and just trying to live as normal a life as a young couple would be doing.
And that relationship through all of that developed and progressed?
Yes, so we got engaged, we got married. It will have been 10 years this year that we'd have been married. And then we decided that we wanted to start a family. And a few years earlier, we had spoken to our oncologist who had suggested freezing some sperm in between and during a treatment break for Andy that he had had. So he hadn't been given, when he was first diagnosed, the option, or no one had spoken to him about freezing his sperm before he had the IL-2 treatment that he'd had before we
Yeah.
met. So there was nothing already frozen pre any kind of treatment. So we had to wait for a relatively big gap in his treatment, by which point a drug might have had its half-life, I think they refer to it as, was at a certain level that we could feasibly freeze some sperm to think about using in the future. So we had that stored, and we were told that you would need to go down IVF if you wanted to have a baby, because you can't try naturally because of the toxicity of the drugs that Andy's on. So we kicked off our IVF cycle because we weren't seeing enough of hospitals in other aspects of our life, obviously.
Okay. Obviously, we know the result of that. A lovely little girl.
Yes, we were delighted that we fell pregnant on our first cycle. So that was brilliant. She was born in February 2020, just before the lockdown.
Wow. Wow. I don't think we even go there with what that would be like for a new baby. I think there's enough been written and said, hasn't there, about sort of lockdown COVID babies. So,
No.
but you have enough going on at this point. We know, or I know, should I say, that things deteriorated again for Andy. So, what sort of happened? Where did this end up?
Yes, things have been growing progressively over the years, but it was probably November 2022 things started to really decline for us. And at that point, I think we'd swapped drugs again. And unfortunately, we were moving through drugs more quickly than drugs were being trialed. So we were kind of running to the end of our list of options here. And he had a few sites in his lungs. And so his chest was quite badly compromised by this stage, which led him to be susceptible to different infections. And so it was at that point he started picking up infections, a few stints with pneumonia, which would require admittance into hospital and IV antibiotics. Also had quite a large tumour on his psoas muscle, which is a muscle that is sort of near your hip and is quite pivotal in being able to walk. And so his mobility had become quite impacted. Tumour had actually eroded through his hip bone, I believe. And so he was having falls. He was struggling with his walking, and, the falls were always far worse than if I were to fall, for example, because he was on blood thinners, because of complications of blood clots. And so there was all this happening. He had to start walking with a stick, and his leg was becoming weaker and weaker, which was becoming difficult for him to do the things that he liked doing the most because he couldn't walk long distances.
That's difficult for a young couple with a young baby. It's usually difficult enough with a young baby at the
Yeah.
best of times. Throw in COVID and throw in those mobility issues. That must have been a really tough time.
It was really tough. And each time he went into hospital and was off his feet for, 2 weeks or however long he was in there with battling an infection, that just weakened his legs even further.
Mm.
He was just losing the muscle. And so that mobility side of things did progress quite quickly. He found throughout his illness, he, for the most part, did not look like someone with cancer. And I think as soon as he started to show visible signs of his illness, that's what he struggled with the most, because he didn't want people to notice. He didn't want people to think he was different in any way. And he did struggle with that.
And how did you feel? How did you cope with that as his wife by this point?
It was hard to see him feeling like he was losing his dignity, I think. He liked to be able to try and do things on his own, so he reached a point where he couldn't drive, and so he really hated that I was the only one that could drive us anywhere. He every time he had a fall, for example, he was embarrassed, didn't feel like he should have been having these falls. He hated that he couldn't help as much at home and with Ada because of his mobility, and so it was really hard to see him lose a part of what had made him him. And I could see that he was mentally struggling with not being able to do the things that he wanted to do.
What sort of mental support or mental health support was there for Andy? Did he I seem to remember it was primarily you that was on the forum rather than Andy. What support for him was there?
We had a very different way of dealing with things. And I think I was someone that liked to fill my head with as much information as I possibly could. And that was the way that I dealt with things. Whereas for Andy, I think he preferred to, he was ever the optimist. He preferred to, you know, not know how bleak things might be. And so he did internalize, I think, a lot of how he felt. He did at one point see a counselor, which I think helped a little, but I don't think he was fully engaged in that process. I think his work for a long time gave him a lot of purpose.
Right.
So that was difficult for him. So he's had to stop working early 2023. So just a few months after he'd started that decline. And he found that quite hard because I think that had given him a real sense of purpose over the years. Yes. And something to focus on. And so without that, I think he struggled mentally with feeling like he was doing what he wanted to and should have been doing as a man in his mid-30s with a young family.
Yeah, I mean, that's really hard to listen to, never mind be a part of, isn't it? And I can only imagine how tough that was for you guys going through that. You say, especially with such a young daughter. I mean, without wishing to sort of bypass anything, at this point, things were really bleak for Andy now, weren't they? And unfortunately, Andy passed away. And if only that was sort of the end of the story, but sort of whatever feels comfortable, just talk me through those sort of last few weeks and how difficult that was for you all.
Yeah, so December 23 rolled round, and at that point, the mobility was not good. He'd had a year of being in and out of hospital. He was still determined to make it up the stairs every night to bed, but that might take him, 10 minutes on his hands and knees trying to catch his breath on the way. Had started vomiting quite a lot. He was losing a lot of weight. He had very bad lymphedema. And that also impacted his mobility because it was in his leg, or both legs, but primarily his bad leg. And we made it out on Christmas Day to his mum's with him, bless him, being sick the whole way there in the car. And then we made it out on Boxing Day to my cousins more comfortably. And that was his last actual day out, that Boxing Day. So he deteriorated again in early January, went back into hospital with fluid on his lungs, which was drained surgically. He came home for 10 days. By this stage, we couldn't have him home and being upstairs. So we had a hospital bed set up. We had, all of that equipment, the stool for the toilet, all of that sort of stuff in place. He already had an oxygen machine at home, so we had that moved downstairs from upstairs because he used to use that at night. And by this stage, we were under hospice care. So we were having a hospice nurse come out every day, along with some carers actually to help me with sort of just giving him a wash and helping with a few of those bits, like moving him around. And it was one day in early February that the hospice nurse came and said, "Your chest doesn't sound good. It sounds crackly. I think you should go back into hospital." And so we got back to hospital where he was diagnosed with pneumonia again. But the doctors, they felt like they could get on top of it with antibiotics. And so we still thought we had a few more months. We had an unopened, brand new mobility scooter sat in the hallway at home that we thought, oh, when it gets to spring, we'll get out on that. We'll try and do some days out somewhere. So he went into hospital on the Thursday night. Over the weekend, it just became really apparent that he was not responding to medication. He was getting worse. And he sadly, yeah, he sadly died on the Tuesday. So he went in on the Thursday and yeah, he died Tuesday morning.
I mean, that's quite a story in its own, isn't it? It's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking for two people who'd come together at such a young age, and this bomb smashed through your relationship at times. I mean, I know there were some really good times, and you talk around some of those, but just heartbreaking to hear that story again, and I'm sure people listening for the first time won't fail to have an emotional sort of reaction to that. I mean, if only that's where it ended though, Charlotte, because I remember sort of communicating with you sort of over and at the time Andy had passed away and not long after his funeral. And it only felt a couple of days after his funeral. I mean, I can't tell how long ago it was or what the distance was. So what happened next? And if you're listening to this right now, you probably won't believe what you're about to hear.
Yes. So I had been in the thick for a few weeks of doing everything that you have to do when someone dies. So it's, planning the funeral, all of the endless amount of paperwork. He died just 5 days before our daughter's fourth birthday. So we already had a party planned. So I had to go ahead and host a fourth birthday party. The funeral took place, and the funeral, I always said there's nothing I would have changed about the funeral apart from the fact it had to happen in the first place. It was just a beautiful day, and I was just about starting to break the back of most of what felt like endless admin. And I gave myself a day off on a Sunday from admin, and I took my daughter to her swimming lesson. And we, as a treat, went to McDonald's for lunch, and then we went to the cinema locally. And in the morning, I'd had this tiny, tiny hint of blood in my urine. And I thought, oh, that's odd. I'll keep an eye on that. It might be a UTI. Upon coming out of the cinema, we both went to the toilet, and I was shocked to see that my urine basically resembled red wine in colour. And I just knew that I had to get myself to a hospital, knowing how well Andy's symptoms had started back when he was first diagnosed. And so I called my dad from actually on the walk back to the car from the cinema, and I asked him to come and sit with Ada so that I could drive myself to A&E. So this was 13 days after his funeral, and I was driving myself to A&E. So I got to A&E. I felt absolutely fine, other than the fact that my urine was not the right colour. Sat there for a few hours, started to feel increasingly worse. And at that point, I realised I needed someone with me because I wasn't feeling with it enough to sort of talk for myself and, advocate for my care. And so my dad came up to the hospital, left my daughter with my mum. And at that point, I was in quite a lot of pain, still in the waiting room. The blood was clotting, so I couldn't pass any urine. And so I was really uncomfortable from that. I was vomiting from the pain, and it reached a point after I think I'd been in A&E for about 5 hours when my dad begged them for a bed, which was just in time because the pain got worse. And I was whisked off for a CT scan with them thinking that I had kidney stones, and I knew it wasn't kidney stones. And I had the CT scan, and the results came back to say that I had a lesion on my left kidney. And so 13 days after Andy's funeral, I was being told that I had kidney cancer, which is the same type of cancer that had killed my husband.
I mean, wow, my body is in some kind of sensation now just listening to that. I mean, how do you even hear that? How do you process that? And I know it went on to become on sitting in a hospital with the same medical team that had looked after your husband for so long. How do you even get your head around that, Charlotte?
I mean, it was just bizarre. And I know sometimes people laugh, don't they, when they're faced with ridiculous situations. And to be honest, I think I did at one stage. I went straight onto survival mode and emailed Andy's oncologist, who obviously I knew quite well. She got her hands on my NHS scans. She briefed a surgeon in the background. I'd been admitted for a few days because I also had an infection of the kidney. And so all of this was happening behind the scenes. I was lucky enough to have private healthcare, which I transferred over to as soon as I was discharged. And from walking into A&E to having my entire kidney removed, it was 11 days. And that was with Easter weekend in between. It was with pre-ops, extra scans, all of that sort of stuff. But yes, it was bizarre. So I remember walking in to see the surgeon, and I walked into the room and he just looked at me and he said, "This is unbelievable." And I was like, "Yeah, I know." I was like, I don't quite believe it myself." And there was one point I was in London for one of my pre-ops, waiting for my train home from London Bridge, and I bumped into a colleague who had known that Andy had died and knew that I was off on bereavement leave. And I was wandering around a shop waiting for my train, saw her. She said, what are you doing here?" And I just burst out laughing. And I was like, "Well, you're not going to believe this, but I've got kidney cancer. I'm having my kidney removed next week." And she started laughing with me. And it was just the most bizarre conversation. She was like, I don't understand what you're telling me. Like, what do you mean?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've got kidney cancer and they're taking my kidney out." And it was just surreal. And so the hospital I had the surgery in was the same hospital Andy had died in only 7 weeks earlier. The nurse that was on admission when I was admitted was the same nurse that had been on shift when Andy died. I recognised heaps of the staff, the physio, and actually the word had got round that Andy's wife was going to be coming in and she now had kidney cancer. And so all of the staff were coming to see me and say hello. I felt like something of a celebrity, to be honest. It was bizarre. But word hadn't reached the physiotherapy team. And I remember them coming into the room after my surgery and the guy looking at me. And he was the same guy that I'd been discussing home physio care plans with a few weeks earlier for Andy. And there I was, lying in a hospital bed. And he did a double take. And I was like, yeah, yeah, it's me. I'm your patient today. Yeah, very weird. But also I had a lot of comfort from seeing so many familiar faces, so that was nice.
How are you now, Charlotte? You had the kidney removed.
Um,
How are you now?
Good. So the pathology came back a few weeks later, and luckily it had been confirmed that it had all been contained within the kidney, the cancer. And they'd also removed a few lymph nodes as well, and they were clear of cancer. So the surgeon felt quite confident that they'd removed all of the cancer. And I didn't need any further treatment, but would have the regular scans. So they have continued to be NED, so no evidence of disease. And I'm coming up for my next scan, which will be my 2-year mark in a few weeks' time. So physically, yes, I'm doing very good, but that doesn't take into account the mental toll that a cancer diagnosis can have, as you know, and that the crippling anxiety that I think came with it. I just watched the person I love die of kidney cancer, which had come back after a kidney removal. And so it was hard to accept that for me, my outcome could be anything but different because I'd had exactly the same diagnosis. It wasn't the same, his was more aggressive, everyone's different, but I found that quite hard to reconcile. And also, he was the one person I wanted to talk to about it because he was the one person that truly would have actually understood what I was going through. And it just felt cruel that he wasn't there.
I mean, without you going all sort of counsellor on you, for those that don't know, I'm a mental health counsellor, but I hear just how lonely that must have been and how isolating that must have been. I know from knowing you over a period of time, you have a wonderful circle of friends and family, but it's not quite the same, is it, when you get that diagnosis and the one person who would get it isn't there to talk to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just felt an incredible sense of injustice, I guess, in that I had been there for Andy and I had been someone that had cared for someone through their cancer journey. And suddenly I was going through my cancer journey and I had no one. And that's it's a bold statement to make because I had a lot of people in reality, like you say, but I didn't have a partner. And that does feel different. I didn't want my friends to have to help me get undressed after the surgery so that I could have a shower. That wasn't a job that I wanted my friends to help me with. I didn't want to have to rely so heavily on um, grandparents to come and look after me and look after Ada because I was, laid up recovering. They're all the sort of things that you would expect of your partner. And I didn't have one to be able to do that. And that felt really tough as well.
All because of the same disease. I mean, I know we share a common sort of theme of kidney cancer, but it's the same for any cancer, isn't it? Or most cancers that there's so many different variations of it. I know you said it was different sort of aggression and things for Andy, but just explain to us, Charlotte, for anybody who doesn't know, just what it felt like to hear the words "you have cancer."
Well, my first thought was of Ada. Um, and I'd promised Andy in the hours before he died, he was in a coma by then, but I spoke to him a lot and I promised him I would look after Ada. And suddenly here I was being faced with a diagnosis that maybe meant that that wasn't going to be possible. And that was, and she didn't have another parent, like all I could think about was her. And so I think that's why I got into action so quickly because I thought, right, how am I going to fulfill that promise to Andy? Get it out as quick as I can, is what I thought. Like, as soon as I knew it was in me, I didn't want a second opinion. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to push for a partial kidney removal. I just wanted them to cut the whole thing out and just get it gone as quickly as they could. Because in my view, that was me having the best chance of being around for Ada. Because all I could think of was she cannot lose another parent. How do you bounce back from that as a child? And so that was my first thought. The second was like just again the injustice of it. If I had a pound for every time someone said to me over the last couple of years, you're really young to have got kidney cancer. You're not the typical kidney cancer patient. I would be enjoying early retirement at the moment because I'm not. They say that, and neither was Andy either, but they say that typical kidney cancer patients are, I think, over the age of 60. They tend to be more often male, I think, overweight, smokers, drinkers, all of those kind of higher risk factors. And here I was, age 33 at the time. Yes, I drank a bit, never smoked, relatively fit and healthy, eat, relatively well. And I just didn't understand why my body had kidney cancer. Like, it just felt unfair to me.
Mm. So much injustice and as you say, just unfair. It's so unfair that you have had to go through that not once but twice and live with that every day. I guess now you talk about you coming up to your next scan. Yeah, I hear there's every reason to be okay. That there's going to be no nasty surprises, but I know from my own personal experience and working with cancer patients every day, whether that be counselling or whether that be in my advocacy work with Action Kidney Cancer. And you will have seen it on the forums too, just the debilitating state that it can get to when it comes to that scan and then the wait for the results. How do you cope with that? I know you've had one so far, you're coming up to your second one. How do you cope with that, Charlotte? What support's there for you?
Um, Unfortunately, my scan is always early March now, and it coincides with the month of February, which is a difficult month because I have the anniversary of Andy's death, I have my daughter's birthday, I have Andy's birthday, which is at the end of Feb, and then I have the scan. So it gets to this sort of early Feb point of time where I just think to myself, I just need to like buckle in. for the next 6, 7 weeks and just hope for the best, take things day by day, because the anxiety is there. And I think it has lessened slightly with each scan that has been NED. But it's definitely still there. And I, for a long time when I was with Andy, I didn't let myself think about the future too much because it was too scary to think about the future, because I knew what that future looked like. And I knew at some point it would be a future without Andy in it and I'd be a solo parent, etc. And I think there's points now where I let myself start thinking about the future now because there feels a bit more certainty with it. But every time a scan rolls round, it jeopardizes my future planning because I think, oh God, if that scan isn't NED and I have to start treatment, you know, what's it going to affect now for the rest of my life? How is it going to affect me? So I find living in the present to be the easiest thing to do in the run up to
Mm.
this scan, because the thought of what could be in the future is too scary.
I tend to hear you almost talk about life there of trying to rebuild sort of day to day and that little bit more each time you go through a successful scan, the floor becomes a little bit more solid and firm, doesn't it? But
Mhm.
I hear you're almost attached to a bungee rope there of not so fast, and back you come,
Yeah, it's
back into
exactly
this
that.
cancer world.
Yeah, it's like it's the sensation of having to rein yourself in sometimes. You know, if I get too carried away with future planning, there's always that sort of devil on your shoulder that's saying, "Oh, but don't forget, you've got to get through that scan in March first. Don't get too carried away." And yeah, you just have to pull it back sometimes, I think.
I mean, wow. I mean, obviously, best wishes for when it comes round to that scan, and I hope sort of buckling in gets you through February as well as it can do. And I know that there's some amazing friends you've got on Action Kidney Cancers Forum, and they'll be there for you, as will I, for whatever you need over this next sort of few weeks and things. But I guess to sort of starting to wrap up the episode, Charlotte. I mean, what words of advice would you say? I mean, for anybody who's diagnosed with cancer and manages to get to a point where Andy did in spells, and you are right now where you're trying to rebuild your life. You're on either off treatment because everything's okay, you're NED, as you say, no evidence of disease, or if you're on some kind of maintenance treatment where you're over the worst, but you're going sort of, a lot of people now know it as adjuvant treatment, or certainly in the breast cancer world, the maintenance drugs that you take for 5 or 10 years. What would you say to people trying to rebuild their lives? I mean, I've heard you talk about a few different sort of side effects or aspects of treatment that I hadn't thought of. I've talked in the past about benefits and finances, but I've heard you today talk about lymphedema for Andy,
Uh-huh.
something that, yeah, generally tends to be more common with certain type of cancers. Well, I know I was warned about it when I had surgery recently. There's other areas, isn't there, that people don't realize? I mean, people who don't have cancer or have never had the cancer or come into contact with it, it's not just a diagnosis, treatment, and you're better, or to be blunt, you die. It's so much more that comes with it, isn't there?
Yeah, I think a cancer diagnosis changes you forever as a person. Um, I certainly feel that way. And, you know, there can also be a lot around self image, I think, has been something for me since I've had my surgery. Um, and I think social anxiety, if you've been wrapped up in a kind of world. So for 2024, you know, I didn't go anywhere. If it wasn't my house or or a hospital or a funeral, I didn't go anywhere for 6 months. And so when I did finally start going back out into the world, I was really anxious. I was thinking, how am I going to talk to people? I can't join in the small talk of holidays or work because I've done neither this year. Am I going to remember how to hold a conversation that isn't focused around cancer? And so that took a few months of overcoming. I think for me, community. has been important, and not just the immediate community that you have around you, but the community that you find that you think might get it. So that's been Action Kidney Cancer for me, for my cancer diagnosis. But I also joined a charity called Widowed and Young. And so I've got a big widowed friends network now as well. Sometimes I say that I have more widowed friends than non-widowed friends these days. And it's helpful to talk to them, um, and to try and reduce some of that loneliness that can come from both a cancer diagnosis at a young age, but also being widowed at a young age too. Um, and then I guess my final reflection would be, and I think I discussed this with my therapist at some point last year, in some ways, I feel grateful for my cancer diagnosis. Um, and I think the reason for that is, if Andy had died and I hadn't had a cancer diagnosis, I would have wallowed as much as you can wallow when you're a parent of a young child. But I think I probably would have wallowed. But instead, being faced with my own diagnosis so quickly, it's given me even more of an appreciation for life and not knowing what's around the corner. I feel, motivated to see places and do more of the things that make me happy and reconnect more with my purpose. That first summer after my surgery, I took me and Ada on a 2.5 week holiday to Abu Dhabi and Mauritius, and we just had the best adventure together. And would I have done that if I was still in my depths of grief? Um, Possibly not. So I think, yeah, that has made me appreciate life more and live it to the fullest. And I actually think by doing so, I am living for me and for Andy. He
Mm.
didn't get this chance, um, to live life beyond 35. And so the fact that I'm now approaching my 36th birthday, how lucky am I to still be here, to watch our daughter grow, to be able to see new places and spend time with loved ones. And so for me, yeah, there's definitely a sense of gratitude that's come with my diagnosis.
I mean, wow. I mean, before we finish, one final thing. I know you've sort of given me the heads up. Your Widowed and Young organisation have got a little campaign going
Yes.
regarding sort of bereavement payments and an extension. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and where people can find information on that campaign and petition that's going on?
Yes, so there are a few people within Widowed and Young that have set up a campaign called Widows Fight. So when you are widowed, you are often entitled to bereavement support payments. This used to be Widowed Parents Allowance. However, that was scrapped in 2017 and reformed as BSP. BSP lasts for 18 months, and thereafter you get no further financial support. So for lots of families especially with children, it's a huge hit on your household income to lose that support. And so there's a group of people from Widowed and Young that are campaigning to try and reform BSP. So there's a petition that has been set up, which I think has around 21,000 signatures so far. But we're just trying to share that far and wide to those that would like to continue to support the campaign and hopefully have it discussed in Parliament.
Wow, I mean, through my work here about the bereavement support payments and how invaluable they are, because as you say, suddenly, especially if it's the main earner in the family, income is suddenly slashed. And unfortunately, some people don't have life insurance, especially people of your age when you were first diagnosed and Andy was diagnosed. And that can be brutal to lose that level of income. And that period adjustment is vital with that support, isn't it? I will definitely put the link to the petition in the bio for this podcast so people can jump on board
Thank
and
you.
get signing that podcast. I mean, Charlotte, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me today. It's truly a remarkable story, both heartbreaking and inspirational at times. I'd absolutely love to have you back on the podcast in the future should the opportunity arise. And just, yeah, thank you so much for coming on today, Charlotte.
No, thank you for having me. And it brings me a lot of comfort to share Andy's story and keep talking about him, and raise awareness as well of kidney cancer and any types of cancer. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and share our story with you.
You're very welcome. And as I say, I'd love to have that conversation again at some point, should the opportunity arise. So, wow, what a story. And I'm sure you'll agree with me, one that you don't forget very easily. If you liked the podcast, then tune into the next one. These are out every couple of weeks, every 2 weeks or so. They're available via normal sort of podcast routes. For those who want to know a little bit more about my services, please visit my website on www.stevepointoncounsellinandsupport.co.uk or visit any of my social media platforms, Steve Pointon Counselling and Support. I offer, as the name would suggest, some counselling. I do public speaking and some workplace training. But until next time, thank you very much for tuning in.